In 1740, Commodore George Anson and his squadron of 8 British ships had embarked on a secret mission to strike at Spain's empire in the Pacific in the War of Jenkins Ear. Disaster struck as the naval force rounded Cape Horn and sailed through the world's most perilous seas while being chased by a Spanish fleet. What began as a mission for honor, glory, and the British Empire became a harrowing tale of survival that ultimately descended into madness, mayhem, mutiny, and murder. I am Yvette, and thanks for joining me for this first episode of the story of the HMS Wager, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. This series is based on 6 journals and several testimonies from survivors, plus additional research. Be advised that none of the survivors are reliable narrators. I put the story together comparing and contrasting each of the accounts to find the most likely version of events. Links to all the sources are in the description, where you'll also find information on the music I used and ways to support the channel. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. In the 17th century, there were 5 major trading and colonizing empires in Europe who fought each other for international markets and natural resources in the East Indies, Asia, the West Indies, the Americas, and Africa. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and the French empires. Each made trade deals with and subsequently subjugated the indigenous people in these territories to get their hands on highly profitable trade goods, such as spices, hides, dyes, silver, gold, and people. These trading empires, eager to dominate the worldwide trade, spent a lot of money to fight wars to protect and expand their respective markets and to weaken their rivals. Because, as Sir Walter Raleigh put it, whosoever commands the seas commands the trade of the world. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world. The Dutch Empire, after fighting 80 years to gain independence from the Spanish Empire, fought the English Empire for control over the East Indies. Then the Portuguese Empire fought the Dutch Empire for control over Brazil. Then the English Empire fought the Dutch Empire for control over the North American colonies. Then the English, Dutch, and Spanish empires fought the French Empire that wanted to weaken Spain by annexing the Spanish Netherlands. Then the Dutch and Spanish empires fought the French and English empires over international territories. Then the Dutch Empire basically invaded the English Empire and put their stadtholder, Prince Willem of Orange, on the English throne. And then the Dutch, English, and Habsburg empires, joined by the Swedes and Danes, teamed up to fight the French Empire because King Louis XIV. So far, so messy. More details on all the above in my 80 Years' War and New Amsterdam series on this channel. At the start of the 18th century, Spain was struggling with some internal conflicts after King Carlos II of Spain died without heirs. He had named Philippe of Anjou, who was backed by his grandpapa King Louis XIV of France, as his successor, but the Habsburger Archduke Karl of Austria, who was backed by a grand alliance of the Holy Roman, British, Dutch, Portuguese empires and others, wanted that throne instead. Cue the War of Spanish Succession, and Queen Anne's War, and the Great Northern War, redrawing borders all over Europe. Still following? At the end of this conflict in 1714, the English Empire was on the rise, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires, while still powerful, were on the decline. A mere 4 years after everyone made peace with each other, the War of the Quadruple Alliance broke out between Spain and its French-not-French king, and an alliance of the Habsburg, Great Britain, French, and Dutch empires. This war ended in 1720 with the Treaty of The Hague, where most returned all the territories they had captured. After over a century of non-stop wars, everyone was tuckered out from all the fighting, so there was peace. Battered economies could recover, trade resumed in full force, and the treasure chests of all the empires steadily filled up again. But with everyone's economies thriving and their war chests overflowing, rulers did what rulers do and started looking to expand their overseas territories. Again. Expansion meant war. At this point in time, Spain ruled most of Latin America, while Great Britain held the northeast coast of the Americas. But the English had been eyeing all the American continent ever since the late Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell launched his Western design back in 1655. While British merchants weren't allowed to trade in the Spanish-held ports in Latin America, they had found a workaround. Spain had granted the British South Sea Company a so-called asiento, a license to sell some 5,000 African people a year as slaves in Spain's Latin American colonies. The shrewd British merchants used this license to smuggle goods like sugar, dye, and wool on their ships. As Spain ramped up their searches of the English vessels and implemented trade restrictions, the British merchants and their political allies were looking for some kind of pretext to rally the public to support a new war so they could expand Britain's trade monopoly. But they needed the proverbial fuse to light the powder keg, so they could at last beat Spain into submission. Hello, Captain Robert Jenkins. In the Caribbean, a Spanish guardacosta, a privateer always on the hunt for contraband, stopped the Rebecca, a merchant ship from Glasgow, Scotland. They beat up the crew, plundered the vessel, and then, reportedly, a Spanish officer stormed the brig of the ship's master, Captain Robert Jenkins, accused him of smuggling sugar from the Spanish colonies, and then cut off Jenkins's left ear. It's unclear whether it was just a part of the ear or the whole thing. In 1738, the English Parliament wanted to have a little chat with Jenkins and called him to testify before the House of Commons about the incident. Apparently, Jenkins held up his pickled ear in a jar and delivered a fiery testimony announcing loudly that he'd sacrifice himself for his king and country. Oddly, no transcripts exist of this testimony, with some historians claiming Jenkins wasn't even in the country at this time. Or not so oddly, since the ear-cutting incident occurred 7 years earlier, in 1731. Well, the whole situation roused the conservative Tory opposition in Parliament, who were mighty mad at the Spanish audacity. Pamphlets, the newspapers of the time, riled up the public by calling for an ear, and to plunder all that was Spanish. While King George II and the British government, headed by the liberal Whig leader Robert Walpole, were no fans of the Tories, and that's putting it mildly, they reluctantly agreed that it was time to declare war on Spain. Unleash the War of Jenkins Ear. Seriously? Seriously. The Brits would let fly the full force of the Royal Navy against a mighty aggressor Spain to bring the Spanish Empire down a peg or 2 or 10, or better still, wipe them off the world map altogether. It wouldn't surprise you to learn that several members of Parliament were admirals, itching for the eternal praise and glory of winning a sea battle or two. This was all well and good and might have had a smidgen of success had the British Navy been at full force. It wasn't. Not even at half force. The Navy had been neglected since the Spanish Succession War. It could boast but a handful of experienced crews and soldiers, and solid seaworthy ships could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Plus, the administration was a mess, and good luck finding crews. Yet in 1740, English dockyards were brimming with ships as the Navy prepared to launch 2 large fleets and 2 smaller secret ones to destroy Spanish interests wherever they could find them. Broadly gestures at the entire world. The biggest one was headed for the western Mediterranean and the Atlantic to intercept and capture ships going to and from Spanish ports, and La Flota, the infamous Spanish silver fleet bringing silver and other high-value items from the Americas to Spain. The other big one would head to the West Indies for the largest amphibious assault in history. A third, much smaller secret fleet would go to Manila in the Philippines and the East Indies and capture a Spanish galleon loaded with virgin silver and hundreds of thousands of silver coins. This Manila galleon was essential for maintaining Spain's global trading empire. Also, if possible, they should sail on to the west of the West Indies to do some damage on Spanish settlements in Panama, Peru, and Chile, and then return to Manila. And the fourth, equally small secret fleet would round Cape Horn and intercept the Manila galleon on the western Latin America side and do some damage on Spanish settlements in Panama, Peru, and Chile, and then head for Manila to team up with the other fleet. Once the Brits cut Spain off from trade, they could no longer afford to fight the war, and during the ensuing peace talks where they'd beg for mercy, they'd be forced to surrender everything. Then Britain would take over the world. Mwahaha! Command for the third, smaller secret fleet was assigned to Captain George Anson. George Anson had been a sailor since the age of 14 and was a much-respected captain, a formidable seaman, with a reputation for being highly professional yet uncommunicative, humane yet cool, steady under stress and firm. Many talented junior officers were eager to serve under him. Captain Anson was the son of an obscure country squire, and therefore his chances of landing a good promotion were practically nil. But lo and behold, the Lords of the Admiralty appointed 42-year-old Anson to be the commander-in-chief of this Manila expedition. The Commodore of this squadron wasn't in the country, but he was hastily recalled to Portsmouth early September, before war had even been declared. But the orders he received kept changing, and changing again. In January 1740, Anson was given his first marching sailing orders. The whole Manila thing was a bust. And then it wasn't, sort of. But the Fourth Fleet was cancelled, but its mission wasn't. Destinations, the amount of men employed in the mission, its equipment, nothing was certain until the moment of departure. And even then, there were questions. The constant changes and delays drove the Commodore mad. His mission's bottom line was, he had to go round Cape Horn in South America, sail into the Pacific Ocean, and when you shall arrive on the Spanish coast of the South Sea, you are to use your best endeavors to annoy and distress the Spaniards either at sea or land to the utmost of your power by taking, sinking, burning, or otherwise destroying all their ships and vessels that you shall meet with, that they may not be able to send any intelligence by sea along the coast of your being in those parts. His hunting area was between Panama and Lima, where the Spanish galleons usually stopped, and then to sail on to Manila and do some damage there. This wasn't privateering per se, Lord knows the Brits didn't want to be seen as a bunch of rogue pirates, but confiscating the Manila galleon and any other treasure ships was the prime directive. Since the Spanish colonies on the Pacific coast weren't particularly well defended, he could simply seize the settlements or burn them to the ground, your call. He was given land forces and equipment for that part of the mission. Anson should also try to get the Native Americans to join him in the destruction of the Spanish Empire. Everyone knew the local populations were no fans of the oppressing Spaniards, and they gladly helped so they could secure their own freedom. Because the mission had to be carried out in the most secret, expeditious manner, and to prevent any intelligence from falling into the hands of the Spaniards, we have ordered you to be furnished with a cipher, in which manner only you are to correspond with our Admiral or the Commander-in-Chief of any of our ships. If details of the mission leaked, Anson's squadron risked getting intercepted by a Spanish fleet. The details leaked. In October 1739, war had officially been declared. In December, the missions of the fleets had been determined, and in January 1740 the orders had been issued, but getting the fleets ready was quite a challenge. Quite as in that it was nigh impossible. The larger, more important fleets got all the supplies and men, and the Commodore and his small squadron of 5 men of war, 1 sloop and 2 victualling pinks had to wait in Portsmouth. And wait, and wait. Anson and his captains constantly battled with the reluctant dockyard officials to get the ships fixed and seaworthy. There was no time to waste. They had to set sail by July because if they rounded Cape Horn after the austral summer, which runs from December to February, the squadron and its mission were doomed. Sure, the sailing conditions around the Cape were always treacherous with icebergs and storms, but during the winter, it was nigh impossible. But no need to hurry. 6 months after the declaration of war, the ships of the small squadron still weren't seaworthy enough to set sail. Generally, wooden ships were built to last 14 years, but after a long voyage they were falling apart and needed new masts, sails, rigging, and other repairs. The wood was eaten up by a variety of creepy crawlies, if the fungus didn't rot the planks and sank a ship first. Anson's vessels just lay there, rotting on Rotten Row, the place where ships waiting to be repaired go to die. Truth be told, wars were spendy, and there simply wasn't enough money to fix it all. To make matters worse, the English press were happy to print all the scoops surrounding the delayed little squadron. The London Evening Post told its readers, and spies, Commodore Anson and the ships under his command, it's said, are actually victualled for 22 months, and the sea and land officers on board have great lucrative expectations from the expedition they are about to be employed in. However, the squadron was delayed, and delays meant secrets could leak, which they did. The Spaniards had spies all over the place, who quickly got all the deets of all the missions. Spain warned the governors of all its South American colonies to prepare for the British fleets. In August, Anson was told that the viceroys of Peru and Mexico had been accurately informed of the size and intent of his squadron. They were ready for him. Anson was eager to get the show on the road, waves. But his fifth man of war, the Wager, hadn't even arrived yet. The HMS Wager, named in honor of Sir Charles Wager, the 74-year-old First Lord of the Admiralty, lay 80 miles northeast at Deptford, a royal dockyard on the Thames. The Wager wasn't actually a man of war. She was a 123-foot East Indiaman built in 1734. Navies generally commandeered ships during wartime. That was a lot cheaper than building a new one. But the British Navy bought the Wager from the East India Company for nearly £4,000 to be used as a stores ship. The Wager wasn't built for war, but they certainly wanted her to become that, so they refurbished her to become a sixth-rate man of war, the lowest rank, on account of there only being 28 cannons on board. The makeover included rearranging the cabins, cutting holes in the outer walls, and removing a staircase. She was wider and therefore more comfortable for crews than ordinary sixth-rate ships, but it made her less suited for rough seas and headwinds. The Wager would carry naval supplies, such as victuals, merchandise to use for trade with the Indians, brandy and wine, and her holds held military supplies for the squadron's land forces for the attack on the Spanish settlements. These included cannons, Coehorn mortars, guns, ammo, tents, spades, 10,000 sandbags, and the like. 56-year-old Captain Daniel "Dandy" Kidd had been appointed as the Wager's commander. Kidd was reportedly a descendant of the infamous privateer pirate Captain William Kidd. In March 1740, the refurbished Wager was ready to set sail. Then the Thames froze, keeping the ship stuck for another 2 months. In May 1740, the Wager finally left Deptford and immediately ran aground just coming out of the Thames. The crew managed to dislodge her, and she arrived in Portsmouth Harbor in July, 9 months after the war began. And suddenly, everyone was ready to go, except they were undermanned, and a proper crew was hard to find. To execute the mission properly, every ship in Anson's squadron needed enough crew to man the ship, and each ship had to be packed to the rafters with soldiers. Despite the promise of a very lucrative payday, crews received a portion of all captured loot. There weren't enough volunteers. While Navy men ran all over town hunting for crewmen, the already recruited fell ill and had to be taken to the hospital. Some ended up dying before ever setting sail. Since the volunteers weren't volunteering, armed posses were sent out to press gang sailors into service, aka kidnapping them. Sailors were identified by their clothing, hats, and tarred fingers. Press gangs also went out to intercept incoming merchant vessels and simply abscond with their crews. Seaman Alexander Campbell had been away from home for years and was ready for some downtime. But when he saw a press gang hauling off a poor whaling sod, he volunteered as a tribute. Commodore Anson rewarded him by making him a midshipman, an officer of the lowest rank, but an officer nonetheless. Many sailors took extreme measures to stay out of the gang's hands. They hid, listed themselves as dead in the muster books, disguised themselves in women's clothes, and jumped merchant ships before sailing into a harbor. The unlucky sailors who didn't get away were put in heavily guarded tenders, floating jails, and transported to the fleet. But kidnapped men don't a good crew make. According to Anson, they didn't possess honor, courage, steadiness. But beggars can't be choosers. With security being lax, some 240 press-ganged men managed to sneak off the ship and get back to shore, where the local authorities chased them, rounded them up, and sent them back. Anson ordered the squadron to move away from the shore so that no one could swim back to safety. Few sailors could swim at this time. When a ship went down, you generally drowned either way. The Navy also needed soldiers for the mission. They couldn't be found either. So they rounded up 500 men from the Corps of Invalids, infirm soldiers in the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. Anson expected to receive the best of a bad bunch, but the best were pretty sad looking. Many were in their 60s and even 70s, deemed unfit for service. Some were blind, deaf, or missing limbs. On their way to Portsmouth, nearly half of those who could walk slipped away. Anson dismissed the worst off, but his superiors ordered them back on board. Some had to be lifted on board on stretchers. Great. They'd be gone before they even got to the scene of the action. On August 8th, to compensate for the loss of the runaway invalids, the government sent over some 210 Marines. Marines were a separate army branch with their own officers. But, there's always a but, many Marines were fresh recruits who'd never set foot on a ship, and none of them had received enough training to be permitted to fire. This was getting better and better. The squadron now had 470 invalids and Marines, but the ships had room for a lot less. Sleeping arrangements were made by rank. The captain had the best room, officers had berths, and others slept in hammocks. Midshipmen in their own quarters had a little more space than the lower-ranking crew, and the lowest rank slept in the nooks and crannies of the ship. On board were craftsmen like carpenters, sailmakers, armorers, coopers, a cook, and dozens of boys, some as young as 6, who were in training. While uniforms didn't exist, the Navy did issue the crew slops, a basic set of clothing. There were hats against the sun, short jackets, and short trousers so they wouldn't get caught in the ropes. After an 8-month delay, it was time to cast off. Well, no. It was stormy season. They had to wait for a clear day to sail out. On August 10th, 1740, the 5 men of war, the flagship the Centurion, the Gloucester, the Severn, the Pearl, and the Wager, a scouting sloop, the Trial, plus 2 small cargo ships, Pinks, the Anna, and the Industry, that would accompany the squadron part of the way, sailed out of the English Channel toward the Atlantic with several other squadrons, 21 men of war in all. It got far too crowded, and after playing bumper cars with several other ships and the wind shifted, Anson returned to the starting point. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. Finally, on September 9, 1740, Anson had orders not to wait for other squadrons and get underway by himself. And then the orders changed again. Some other ships would accompany him to Madeira, a Portuguese-held island off the northwest coast of Africa. On September 18th, the wind was favorable, and Anson's squadron headed out to hunt that elusive Manila galleon and rake in the cash. Oh, and help destroy the Spanish Empire, of course. At about the same time, the French King of Spain, Philippe, sent Rear Admiral Don José Alfonso Pizarro Marqués de Villar out with a neat little armada to intercept Anson's mini-armada. The previous year, Admiral Pizarro had very deftly dodged the large English fleet lying in wait off Cadiz for the Spanish Silver Fleet and brought La Flota into Port Hondero, or as the Spanish called it, Santander. He was considered the best man for the job of ruining Anson's little secret, not-so-secret mission. If the 2 fleets clashed, Pizarro's fleet with 2 third-rate ships and 282 guns total would outmatch Anson's largest 2 fourth-rate ships and a total of 232 cannons. Pizarro also had a regiment of soldiers on board that needed a ride to the colonies in the Americas. Anson's squadron cleared the channel in 4 days and headed for Madeira. This leg of the journey should have taken 12 days, or even 10 days with the right winds, but much to the frustration of the crews, it took them over 40. We're off to a great start. On October 13th, Philip Merritt, a common soldier, died. He was the first man they lost on this mission, but he certainly wasn't the last. In the afternoon of October 29th, the squadron finally anchored in Funchal, the only town on the island. Meals on board consisted of salted beef and pork, dried peas, oatmeal and biscuits, which were kept in watertight casks. But this was their last chance to stock up on water, wine, and other fresh provisions before making the nearly 5,000-mile crossing to the Brazilian coast. The crewmen remained on board, but Commodore Anson paid a visit to the Portuguese governor of the island, Dom João de Almeida de Melo, Count of Galveia. The governor told him that for the past couple of days, a fleet of 7 or 8 ships of the line and a patache were recorded cruising up and down on the west side of the island. They were likely a Spanish fleet, or French, or Dutch. Melo swore on his honor that no one on the island had told anyone anything about Anson's squadron. The Commodore sent out an English privateer sloop with one of his own officers to reconnoiter the fleet's colors, but the man returned without seeing anything. So, who were they? They were on the west side of the island, the ideal place for an ambush. An attack would force the squadron to toss overboard anything that got in the way of the cannons, mostly food and drink, which would have delayed the mission even more. Well, it was Rear Admiral Pizarro's fleet, who only wanted to spy on them and get an idea of their size. Pizarro ridiculously outmatched them and wasn't going to engage just yet. He had soldiers to deliver. By now, the entire plan had changed so often it was a miracle anyone even knew what they were supposed to do, but more changes were coming. On November 3, 1740, there was an unexpected shakeup. Captain of the Gloucester, Richard Norris, son of celebrated Admiral Sir John Norris, aka a Nepo baby, had been ill ever since they left England. He sent a letter to the Commodore asking to quit his command of that vessel and return home to recover. Commodore Anson and the others snorted, coward. But with him gone, there were some removes. That is, all the captains were rotated up. Captain Matthew Mitchell of the 5th-rate Pearl became the captain of the 4th-rate Gloucester. Daniel Kidd of the 6th-rate Wager went to the 5th-rate Pearl, and Captain Murray of the trial sloop replaced Kidd on the 6th-rate Wager. But who take command of the trial sloop became a bit of a thing. Ultimately, Anson chose his first lieutenant, the Scot David Cheap. Scott was the son of the 2nd Laird of Rossi, but after his father died when he was 12, his brother inherited the estate and David had to earn his own living. He joined the Navy aged 17 and spent most of his time in the West Indies. Anson's first lieutenant finally got his chance to live the dream and captain a ship. David Cheap was 43. A lieutenant was generally promoted to captain before his 30s after 6 years of service, but it depended on money and connections, not so much experience, and, well, as lieutenant longing for a promotion toasted to a bloody war or sickly season it was then. On Wednesday, November 5th, 9 days after arriving at Madeira, Anson's squadron got ready to weigh anchor. But with enemy vessels possibly lurking nearby, they waited until dark before leaving, and all ships doused the lights so they could slip away unseen. Anson gave the captains the latest orders. Their first rendezvous point was Santiago, one of the Cape Verde Islands. If the Centurion wasn't there, they should go to Santa Catarina on the Brazilian coast and wait for each other. Understood? Aye, aye, sir. And off they went. But now the Commodore changed plans. Since it was late in the year, a rendezvous at the Cape Verde Islands would only delay them, so skip Santiago, go straight to Santa Catarina, and wait there for everyone to catch up. Aye, aye, sir. On November 16, 1740, the captains of the cargo ships, the Anna and the Industry, told Commodore Anson that they had fulfilled their contract and wanted to be unloaded and dismissed. Anson consulted the captains. Anyone got storage space? Nope. Their decks were filled to capacity. It would be hard enough to load up the brandy of the Industry alone. Then only the Industry Pink could go. The Anna Pink was more seaworthy and, well, they just needed her storage. They made a new contract with that Pink, and Anson launched the transport ships to shuttle some of the Industry's cargo to the Anna and distributed the rest to every ship in proportion. Meanwhile, most of the squadron's officers quickly wrote their friends and family back home and sent the letters along with the Industry. Who knew when they would have another opportunity? On November 19th at 8 p.m., the Industry waved everyone goodbye and headed to Barbados to pick up a shipment for England. Well, the Spanish captured her soon after, and those letters never arrived. On November 20th, all the captains of the squadron told the Commodore that their ship's companies were very ill. Typhus had hit and spread like wildfire. Many in the crew, burning up with fever and throwing up, could no longer climb masts and just languished in their hammocks. Surgeons improvised sick bays on the lower decks, literally under the weather. They didn't know that typhus was caused by bacteria from lice poop. They thought it was an airborne illness caused by mold, meat, or sweat, and air circulation was the cure. But the ships were too deep in the water and couldn't possibly open their lower ports to let air in. The Commodore ordered 6 air scuttles to be cut in each ship. It didn't stop the plague. On the morning of December 2nd, sails were seen in the northwest and the chase was on. Anson was worried this ship was a messenger ship from Spain to Buenos Aires with all the details of their secret, not-so-secret expedition. But they lost sight of the ship at nightfall. Meanwhile, the Wager had been ordered to take the Anna Pink in tow, but they were now so far astern that the rest slowed down so they could catch up. They saw the same vessel again the following day. They chased it all day, until they lost sight of her again at nighttime. Once again, they collected the scattered squadron. As they found out later, she was an English East India Company merchantman, bound for St. Helena. Many had died from typhus, including the Centurion surgeon Thomas Waller. Another round of removes. The Wager surgeon Henry Ettrick was sent to the Centurion, the trial surgeon Walter Elliot went to the Wager, and the surgeon's first mate of the Centurion, Joseph Allen, went to the trial. On ships, the dead were sewn into their hammocks along with a heavy object like a cannonball so they'd sink before the sharks could have a nibble. After a grave ceremony with a bit of sailor superstition thrown in, the bodies were chucked overboard. The deceased personal effects were auctioned off to raise money for the widow or family. The Commodore was eager to see land to take the sick people ashore so that the healthy ones wouldn't succumb to the disease either. But the dead mounted. On the 14th, Robert Weldon, the purser of the Centurion, passed away. More removes. John Rule, purser of the Wager, replaced him. Thomas Harvey, one of the Centurion's midshipmen, was made purser of the Wager. Finally, on December 16th at 7 a.m., they saw the Brazil coast. 2 days later, around noon, the crew saw the Portuguese-held Santa Catarina. The place, once inhabited by Native Americans, had become a safe haven to vagabonds and outlaws who submitted to the King of Portugal but did their own thing. Things got awkward when the Portuguese government arrived and forced the vagabonds to submit to the new rules. The governor was Dom José Silva Chapache, an army brigadier who had a garrison of soldiers and an appetite for money and all the creative ways to get more, including smuggling. There was a whole Portuguese-Spanish smuggling ring operating in the area. The moment the English squadron came into view, the 2 forts hoisted their colors and fired several guns. Then garrisons ran out of both forts, undoubtedly to defend the place. "Oh no, we're friendlies!" The Commodore quickly sent an officer with a message for Dom José, telling him who they were and to ask for a pilot to guide them into the harbor. The pilot was sent. The first thing Commodore Anson did was to send the hundreds of sick ashore. He ordered each ship to erect 2 tents, one for the diseased and the other for the surgeons and his assistants. Then Anson ordered fresh beef for the sick people and got victuals aboard every ship. But while there was plenty of beef and it was cheap, it was hardly edible. Governor Dom José acted friendly, but he made sure no one could buy the food and drink they needed from the locals. Everything went through him, with a nice markup. Then the crews got to cleaning the ships. They scraped the decks, then they smoked between the decks and finally washed every part well with vinegar to destroy the vermin, like lice, mice, rats and fleas. It was very much needed, because with so many men in such a tight space, the stench on board was so shockingly vile, they were sure this was the cause of the illness. Once the ships were cleaned and aired out, they caulked the ship's sides and decks, overhauled the rigging, and secured the masts against the tempestuous weather of the austral fall. The Commodore ordered each captain to store some of their cannons in the hold, so the ships would be more steady in the mountainous waves. Anson wanted to get out of there yesterday. It was another 2,000 miles south to reach Cape Horn, and they really couldn't afford more delays. While he hoped the retrofitting and the victualling would be done in 2 weeks, the Trial's main topmast and foreyard were found to be decayed and rotten, and her foremast was unfit for service. Fixing that would add another 2 weeks, as the carpenters went into the woods hunting for a nice tree that would make a decent mast. 4 days later, they still hadn't found one. So they secured the mast as well as they could and hoped for the best. On December 27, 1740, Don José blew a gasket when Commodore Anson sent his second lieutenant, Philip Suarez, in an armed 18-oared boat to inspect a vessel he thought might be Spanish. It turned out to be a Portuguese brigantine from Rio Grande. While the whole inspection had gone down very amicably, with the Portuguese captain insisting the Commodore accept a calf as a present, the governor took major offense. This was a violation of the peace between the crowns of Great Britain and Portugal. What an odd thing to say. Well, Don José tried to pick a fight, even taking the gift calf from the vessel by force. He didn't want the English to discover that he had sent an express messenger to deliver a letter to Admiral José Pizarro, who had arrived with his fleet near Buenos Aires at the River of Plate on January 5th, containing all the intel on the British squadron he was chasing. The strength of the ships, guns and men, and any other information Pizarro might find useful. Don José hoped to strengthen ties in his smuggling ring. That sneaky son of a bitch. Pizarro wanted to round Cape Horn before the English. His sailors had been paid in advance because otherwise no one would even want to round the Cape so close to the March equinox. He left with his 5 large ships after a 17-day stay. The Patache had been scuttled and the crew taken aboard the other vessels. He'd been waiting for provisions, but the Admiral left before those arrived 2 days later. But Anson had weighed anchor 4 days before them. They might run into each other soon. On January 18, 1741, Anson's squadron put to sea, glad to put Santa Catarina in the rearview mirror. The month-long stay had been altogether unpleasant. This was no longer the hospitable place of old, when the vagabonds and outlaws helped all those in need for no money, just gifts. But the unpleasantness wasn't just because of the smarmy two-timing governor. The air in Santa Catarina was thick, foggy, and sticky. Those on board were struck down with fevers and dysentery, all the while being devoured by swarms of mosquitoes and other venomous insects. When they packed up and got ready to leave, they had buried 28 men in the shallow sands, but they had more sick men back on board than when they arrived. Commodore Anson let the captains know that even if the Centurion was lost, everyone had to continue the mission no matter what. He presented a contingency plan. In case of separation, the first place of rendezvous was Port St. Julian. There they had to take in as much salt as they could. They were told there was plenty. Salt was used to cure meat, so they lasted longer. They didn't have fridges back then, of course. But if the Commodore hadn't shown up after 10 days, they had to go around Cape Horn into the South Sea to the next rendezvous, cruising off the island of Nostra Senora del Socorro. If they couldn't remain there for whatever reason, they had to make their way to the Juan Fernandez archipelago and cruise there for 56 days. If Anson hadn't showed up by then, they should consider him sent to Davy Jones's locker, put themselves under the command of the senior officer who had orders to annoy the enemy both by sea and land as much as possible. Once their supplies ran down to what was needed for a trip to Macau at the entrance of the Canton River on the coast of China, they should head over there. From there, they were to go back to England for a bit of circumnavigation the globe action. The Anna Pink still couldn't be unloaded, so she was coming with. Those on the Pink were like, "Aww." The weather was generally good as they made their way south. But on January 22nd at 8 a.m., a most violent storm broke out. The fog was so thick, they couldn't see more than 2 ships' length. The entire squadron disappeared from view. The Centurion fired guns to alert the others to her location. Around noon, the fog cleared and everyone could see each other again. Except the Pearl. Where was the Pearl? The Pearl was gone. And shucks. The trial sloop had lost the head of her mainmast in the squall. The Gloucester was ordered to take her in tow because the weather didn't calm until the following day. Meanwhile, the Pearl had lost sight of everyone. Where was everyone? Everyone was gone. On January 31st, 1741, while everyone on the Pearl was on the lookout for any of Anson's ships, her captain, Dandy Kid, died of a fever. On his deathbed, he told his men, brave fellows, to be dutiful to their next commander, and made a will for his 5-year-old son. Then he went all ominous, and, as it turned out, he threw in some spoilers. He said that the voyage, which both officers and sailors had engaged in with so much cheerfulness and alacrity, would prove in the end very far from their expectations. Notwithstanding the vast treasure they imagined gaining from it, it would end in poverty, vermin, famine, death, and destruction. Well, that was a nice way to bid adieu to your crew, lost at sea. On February 10, 1741, those on the Pearl, still trying to find Anson's squadron, finally noticed a fleet with several men of war. They saw a broad red pendant with a swallowtail in one of the ship's main topmast, and a red flag at her ensignmast. Oh good, Commodore Anson's flagship! But something was off. Were those 5 men of war instead of Anson's 4? Once they got within cannon range, they realized they'd been had. It was Rear Admiral Pizarro's Spanish Armada. Pizarro had cleverly hoisted an English pendant to lure any stragglers of Anson's squadron. Well, congratulations, sir. It worked. It was all hands on deck as the Pearl crowded sail, that is to set all sails, to get away. The Spaniards never fired, not even a shot across the bow, but the 5 ships stayed on her heels, and they were gaining on her. The Brits chucked 14 tons worth of water casks overboard. They even ditched the longboat along with her oars, sails, and booms to gain speed. Then night came. At 7 p.m., the Pearl no longer saw the 5 ships, but at 5 a.m. the next morning, whoop, there they were, still giving chase. The Spanish ships gained on the Pearl with her guns packed, primed, and ready to fire once they got in range. Then, horrors upon horrors. The lookouts on the Pearl saw a dark spot dead ahead and rippling waters, oh shucks, that looked a lot like a submerged reef. If they slowed down, death at the Spanish hands was guaranteed. If they kept going full speed, they might get wrecked, and those who survived would be killed by the Spanish. The Pearl decided to go down in a blaze of glory and plowed forward toward the dark area. Pizarro, noticing the same rippling, called off the chase. He smiled. The Pearl would wreck, and then it'd be easy pickings. The English crew braced for impact. Closer, closer, and nothing. It was smooth sailing. The rippling dark spot was a harmless school of spawning fish. By now, the Pearl's lead over their enemy was too great. Pizarro's squadron, equally stunned at the not wrecking of the English ship, tried to catch up. When night fell, the Pearl once more disappeared in the dark. Meanwhile, Anson kept the squadron in a tight formation, ready to do battle with any Spaniard, as they sailed down along the coast of today's Argentina. On February 18th at 6 a.m., Anson saw sails. The Spanish? The Commodore sent the Gloucester in pursuit. At roughly the same time, those on the Pearl spotted sails on the horizon. One of Pizarro's ships was a dead ringer for the Gloucester, and it was coming straight at them. Everyone worked like mad to get the hell out of there. All sails! All sails! There was no escape. The ship gained fast. Oh, it was the Gloucester.
Pearl.
Oh, thank heavens for that. Pizarro, for some reason, some say he was ordered to, avoided engaging with Anson's squadron before they reached the South Seas, but a straggler was always welcome. On February 18, 1741, at 2 p.m., the Pearl had a joyful reunion with the squadron. But they had sad news. Captain Kidd had died. A fresh round of removes. The Wager's Captain Murray went to the larger Pearl, and the Trial's Captain David Cheap went to the Wager, bringing with him his steward, Peter Plasto. And the Commodore promoted his first lieutenant, Charles Saunders, to the Trial, but he was so dangerously ill that moving him to the ship could kill him. So, Philip Samaras, now first lieutenant of the Centurion, you're on deck. For now. Now they knew Pizarro was close, they shouldn't stop at St. Julian's, they should go in pursuit of the enemy instead. But the Trial badly needed a mast, or she'd be lost going around the Cape. So on February 19, 1741, at 6 p.m., the squadron put in at Port St. Julian to fix the Trial. St. Julian's Bay gave the more superstitious crewmen the creeps. It was infamous. In the centuries before, both Ferdinand Magellan and Sir Francis Drake killed alleged mutineers on the island in the bay, which was now called the Island of True Justice and Judgment, or, as some like to call it, Island of Blood. Those in Anson's squadron noticed shrimp in the water that were so red it was like they'd been boiled and made the sea look like blood. Bad omen. The carpenters rummaged around in the Wager's hold to find a spare topmast to be fitted on the Trial's mainmast. Couldn't they let the Anna Pink go now, please, pretty please? Another round of discussions. Nope, all decks were still chock-a-block, she was still needed. Aww. In fact, since they were likely to encounter the Spaniards, they moved the provisions that were in the way of the guns aboard the Pink. And yes, they also remounted the cannons they'd put in the hold to have them all primed and ready. They couldn't find fresh water at St. Julian's, and no other refreshments whatsoever. In fact, all the country was quite barren and desolate. The Pearl was given water from the other ships, and the entire fleet was put on water rations. But because the journey looked to be quite harrowing, they decided not to ration anything else. Unfortunately, St. Julian's salt was as mythical as the tales about the place. It was bad, and there wasn't a lot of it. On February 24th, the trial was refitted, and a signal was made for all captains and army officers to come aboard the Centurion for a war council. Their first order of business in the South Seas was to attack the town and harbor of Valdivia in Chile. By his master's orders, this place should become the base of operations for refitting and careening ships. So, new plan. Go to Socorro, wait 10 days, go to Valdivia, cruise there unseen for 14 days. If no one else shows up, then go to Juan Fernandez and wait 56 days. If anyone was captured, destroy all papers. That goes for the Anna Pink as well. Understood? Aye aye, sir. But they had to remain within 2 miles of the Centurion. Anyone on watch who failed in his duty would be punished. Time to round Cape Horn. The seas around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America were, and still are, notoriously tricky and perilous, but worse so without modern navigation tools. The ship's master, the navigation specialist, and his mates calculated and plotted the ship's course, relayed the proper heading to the quartermaster on duty, who then directed the 2 helmsmen who stood at the wheel and steered. While the latitude was easy to calculate, longitude was not. For that, the ship's master used dead reckoning. He dropped a knotted rope in the sea, and using a 30-second hourglass as a timer, he determined the speed. As it turns out, a 28-second hourglass would have given a more accurate speed. In other words, knowing the heading but not the speed, let alone considering the tides and drift, a ship's true position was a bit of a gamble. If you want an example of how far off it could be and the disastrous consequences, check out my series about the Batavia, a VOC ship that wrecked in Australia in 1629, on this channel. Cape Horn is where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet. 2 bodies of water with different temperatures, salinities, and currents made for turbulent seas and unpredictable weather patterns. The region's latitudes from north to south, or bad to worse, was the roaring 40s, furious 50s, and screaming 60s latitudes. Here, intense westerly winds with no obstacles to slow them down can whip up massive waves that break the largest ships. To make matters even more treacherous, Cape Horn's coastline is rocky, and there are hidden reefs, and coupled with poor visibility conditions, many a ship wrecked on those shores. Anson's squadron would go through the Drake Passage, a stretch of water between Cape Horn and Antarctica. They didn't take the shortcut, the Strait of Magellan. That one was too narrow, maze-like, and treacherous in its own way. But in the Drake Passage, they'd move along places like the Island of Desolation, the Port of Famine, and the Bay of Severing of Friends. You know, just something fun to look forward to. The weather could turn on a dime and included rain, sleet, snow, hail, thunder, and lightning, and fog. All this sounds nasty, but I haven't even mentioned the icebergs and sea ice drifting north from Antarctica into these waters. Try navigating that in a wooden vessel with canvas sails. So many ships were lost that the European Empire simply avoided the route altogether. Spain preferred the dangers of transporting goods over land coast to coast through disease-riddled jungles in Panama pre-canal, overcrossing what a 16th century British expedition called the most mad seas. The squadron would round the Cape in March, just in time before the austral winter. Well, they didn't know it, but winter from May to July was less turbulent. The winds were weaker because of the colder air. In fact, March is the area's most violent month. So, strap in, lads. It's gonna be a wild ride. On February 27, 1741, at 7 a.m., the squadron weighed anchor in St. Julian and sailed toward the Passage of Doom. Anson had decided to keep the squadron close together instead of letting each ship take its own course around Cape Horn and meet at the rendezvous on the other side. While this slowed them down, when faced with a formidable enemy, any moment now they expected to see Admiral Pizarro's fleet, it was the best course of action. But the Gloucester didn't move at all. Several guns fired to signal her to make sail had no effect. It wasn't until 1 p.m. the following day that the Gloucester caught up with the squadron. She'd been unable to purchase anchor, that is, loosen the anchor out of the ground. In the end, they had to cut the cable and left that best bower behind. Best in this case means starboard. The anchor on the left was called the small bower. And if you thought that would be a smaller anchor, you'd be wrong, they were usually the same size. The weather was rainy and thick with fog, but on March 4th, on a rare cloudless day, they saw Cape Virgin Mary, the northern boundary of the entrance of the Straits of Magellan. The cape had been named by Ferdinand Magellan. They soon learned that in this region, short bursts of really good weather were invariably followed by the most violent storms. Case in point, at 9 a.m. on March 5th, the wind blew so hard that the Centurion had to reef sail to keep the squadron together, but the current drove them south fast. They set sail again around midnight, and the following morning they saw the tall, craggy, snow-covered hills of Tierra del Fuego. Worried they might overshoot the Le Maire Strait, they lay to that night and prepared for the raging weather they were about to sail into. Everyone secured the cannons and cleared the deck of anything that could fly around. Some captains had all the sails replaced. And because of the impending rough seas, fires were no longer allowed on board, since one wave bumping the ship could set the vessel ablaze. So the cooks couldn't cook, and the men had to eat raw meat. On March 7, 1741, at 4 a.m., the 7 ships set off heading into Le Maire Strait, making sure to keep Staten Island on their left. Staten Island, named after the Dutch government, the Staten-Generaal, is not to be confused with New York's Staten Island, named after the same States General when it was New Amsterdam, New Netherland. Check out my series. While Tierra del Fuego looked extremely barren and desolate, Staten Island looked far more harrowing, savage and gloomy, with tons of jagged rocks on the coast reaching straight up to the sky. The squadron entered the strait at 8 a.m. The Trial and the Pearl led the way, with their lookouts checking for ice, while the slowest ships, the Anna and the Wager, drew up the rear. With a fair wind and a quick tide, they were being swept through fast. After they easily passed through the strait, and with the weather being so nice, they thought they'd made it through the worst part of their journey. They even dared to boast that Captain Kidd's dying prophecy was wrong, and started planning on how they were about to spend all that treasure. They shouldn't have done that. They really shouldn't have done that. Before the sternmost ships, the Anna and the Wager, had even cleared the straits, the azure sky turned the most dismal gloom. A violent storm descended on them and brought massive waves with it. In an instant, the winds and tides turned against them, and all the ships in the squadron were in trouble. Meanwhile, the strong wind pushed the Wager toward the jagged rocks of Staten Island. Oh yeah, they were toast. Captain Cheap got all hands on deck, and he and his crew, by the grace of God, deftly steered the Wager to safety. The sky lowered, and the storms continued all day and night. Everyone had to work the pumps to clear the holds of the excess water crashing down on them, all the while praying that none of those mountainous waves broke over them, or else they'd be sent straight to the bottom. As they moved along, they reached the furious 50s. As the old sailor saying goes, below 40 degrees latitude, there is no law. Below 50 degrees, there is no God. In the furious 50s, it was all hands on deck to brave the raging waves, but many couldn't get out of their hammocks. Yes, the typhus was gone, but now it was scurvy time. Scurvy is a debilitating disease caused by a lack of vitamin C found in fruit and vegetables, the one thing a ship didn't have in abundance. Shivering, sores, swelling, gingivitis, fever, violent joint pains, constipation, difficulty breathing, depression, hallucinations, and a loss of energy to the point of death are just a few on the long list of dreadful symptoms. The most extraordinary the crew reported seeing were the invalids aboard, some of whom had been wounded 50 years ago at the Battle of the Boyne, who had their wounds burst open as if they'd never healed, and mended broken bones suddenly appeared as if they'd never been set. All the ships in the squadron were quickly running out of hands to sail them. Death rights were thrown overboard, along with the mounting dead. Not all bodies were sewed in hammocks anymore, and sometimes bodies just washed about the decks because there were no hands to bury the men at sea. Those who were healthy enough to do duty weren't safe either. Because of the sudden violent jerks caused by the waves, men were in constant danger of being dashed to pieces against the decks or sides of the ship. Even those who secured themselves broke legs, broke necks, and a multitude of other bones. One of the Centurion's boatswain's mates broke his collarbone twice. The list of such accidents was endless. The captain often simply had to reef most, if not all, sails and just lie there at the mercy of the waves. And if the weather improved and they set sail one moment, an unexpected squall ripped those sails to shreds the next. And if that wasn't bad enough, rain turned to sleet, sleet turned to snow. The snow and ice froze the sails and encased the rigging, making all the cordage brittle and snap on the slightest strain. The cold added even more danger to those working on the ships. Many suffered from frostbite, losing fingers and toes in the sub-zero temperatures. And if that wasn't bad enough, because it got worse, men could drown in the ship. The waves crashing onto the vessels caused the decks to be flooded, and if they didn't get to the upper decks in time, they tumbled in the water like a load of laundry in a washing machine. One time the waves crashed onto the Centurion so hard fore and aft that she lay quite on her side for some time, until she thankfully righted again, but slowly, that it threw down and half drowned all the people on deck, but no one got hurt and no damage was done. In short, scurvy, violent waves, the cold, drowning, all things that could kill a man aboard Anson's squadron. On March 11, 1741, the Anna Pink disappeared. Oh no, but she popped up again 6 days later. Oh good. By March 18th, the ships had suffered such severe beatings that the planks loosened and water came through every seam. Often the officers were driven out of their berths because of the deluge of water coming in. When the sails ripped, the crews attempted to repair them, but some just flew away. Only when the weather was calm could they fix things. Calm days were fewer and farther between. As they moved along the Drake Passage, it seemed every storm was more insane than the next, with hurricane-like winds, or rather, actual hurricanes, forcing them to lie under bare poles. On the afternoon of March 24th, the weather calmed again for 4 days. But now there was a thick fog, and the Centurion had to fire guns nearly every half hour to keep the squadron together. Then, on March 31st, the Gloucester fired a gun and made a sign they needed to speak with the Commodore. The Centurion immediately bore down on her. What terrible disaster had befallen them now? Oh, they could already see it. The Gloucester's mainyard was broken in the slings. Now the entire squadron, ordered to stick together, was slowed down to allow the Gloucester to keep up. So they were gonna be stuck even longer in the inhospitable climate. Just great. Maybe rounding Cape Horn was too big of an ask. They heard the stories, but believed they were just tall tales told by incompetent sailors. Well, they had survived, so they were obviously competent. But no time to waste. The Commodore ordered several carpenters from the other ships of the squadron to go aboard the Gloucester to repair her damage as fast as they could. Then the trials captain complained they were taking on so much water that their pumps couldn't keep up. The Commodore promptly ordered the pump from the Centurion to be fitted on the trial. Thankfully, the weather was calm enough for long enough to transport everyone and everything. But the peace and quiet didn't last long. The sky once more became dark and gloomy. The wind picked up in squalls. They could still sail, but another storm was imminent. All hell broke loose on April 3rd, and for 3 days they were caught in the severest storm they had yet encountered, pushing all ships beyond their limits. More masts snapped, more rigging broke, more sails ripped. On April 8th at 3 a.m., the sounds of several guns fired to leeward. Someone was in distress. The Commodore signaled for the squadron to bring to. At daybreak, they saw the Wager, a considerable way downwind from any of the other ships. They bore down on her. During a deep roll, all the chain plates to windward had broken, and the waves carried away her mizzenmast and the main topsail yard. Those needed to be fixed, because without them she was doomed. But the Wager's carpenter, John Cummins, was still on the Gloucester, and the storm prevented him from returning. The Wager, held together by hope, rope, and a prayer, steadied a little and sailed on. The very next day, the Anna Pink gave distress signals. Her forestay and the gammon of the bowsprit had come undone. With this rigging falling apart, nothing but gravity and a few wedges held her mast up. Meanwhile, the Severn and the Pearl started trailing behind. Since they didn't signal distress, some thought they lagged on purpose. But Anson believed the captains had legitimate reasons to retreat. Then, on April 10th, these two vessels, two dots on the horizon, disappeared. The remaining squadron of 5, 3 men of war, a sloop and a pink, tried their best to stay together. On April 12, 1741 at 7 a.m., the Wager got swamped by massive waves, hurling the gunner John Bulkley, the warrant officer standing watch, over the wheel. On deck were 4 transport vessels, a longboat, a cutter, a barge, and a yawl. The wave half filled the longboat, flooded the cutter, which then shoved into the barge. The gunner implored the boatswain, John King, to chuck the cutter overboard. King was the crew's boss, and while boatswains were supposed to be tough to handle the unruly lot, King was a special kind of rough. When the boatswain suggested ditching the cutter to Captain Cheap, who was ill in his cabin with scurvy, or as he liked to call it, rheumatism, wouldn't hear of it, and instructed them to save all the transport boats. And so, the gunner righted the cutter, made holes in the longboat to drain it, and then raced to save the bowsprit. On April 13th, Anson's squadron dead reckoned the latitude and figured they were close to the west entrance of the Magellan Strait. Any day now, they'd be in the tranquil Pacific Ocean. They compensated for drift by doubling the distance of previous navigators. They turned north. On April 14, 1741, at around 1:30 a.m., the hazy weather suddenly cleared for a moment. The Anna's lookout saw something dark looming straight ahead, barely visible in the moonlight. Rocks? No, cliffs! Islands a mere 2 miles ahead! The Anna's crew fired 2 shots to warn the others, turn now! Had it not been for the moonlight and a sudden shift of wind, they would have all taken a trip to Davy Jones's locker. The dead reckoning had been dead wrong, even with its extra allowances. A point called Cape Noir came into view. So, it was 300 miles short. Damn. Now they had to go south again, back into the western blasts, hurricanes, and mountainous sea that had made grown men weep. This disappointment proved just too much for the crews. They now realized the Severn and the Pearl had probably wrecked on those shores they had so narrowly missed. Crewmen lay down in despair, lamenting their fate, and some began to envy the dead, still being dropped over the sides of the ships every day. They were never gonna make it out of the Drake Passage, were they? Commodore Anson tried to cheer up the crew, sharing his brandy and rolling up his sleeves to help naval hierarchy be damned. Meanwhile, Carpenter Cummins had returned to the Wager and had to inform the Commodore that it was bad. Really bad. As in, the Wager was doomed. All the rigging was ruined or gone, and almost the entire crew was down and disabled. Those who could still walk were so stretched to the limit, doing double and even triple shifts, that they were about to fall down. The rest of the squad wasn't doing much better. The Centurion went from 200 men per watch to 6. Some vessels didn't even have enough hands to raise a sail. Anson told Captain Cheap to take measures to fix all that was broken and try to keep up with him. The carpenter jury-rigged some kind of replacement for the mizzen using one of the lower stunsail booms. It wasn't pretty, and it also didn't work. As one crewman put it, the ship was in the most crazy condition. April 22nd brought some relief. Finally, pleasant weather. Well, as pleasant as could be expected around these here parts. The Wager crew, those still standing, worked on untangling the rigging and bent a new mainsail, elevating the ship to 1 step above a wreck. On April 24th in the evening, the wind picked up again and turned into a phenomenal storm with extremely thick weather. Several crewmen on the Wager's quarterdeck saw the Centurion's lantern lights far off in the distance. They were lagging. At 9 p.m. the lights vanished, and those on the Wager never saw the Centurion again. Around midnight, the Centurion lost sight of all 4 ships, the Gloucester, the Trial, the Anna, and the Wager. They also lost nearly all sails, and then the rigging broke and they lost the main stunsail boom. What a mess. Fortunately, they fixed the rigging 12 hours later, but the squadron was still nowhere to be seen. It was a bitter pill for Commodore Anson to swallow. They'd managed to mostly keep together for 7 weeks in all the turbulent weather, only to lose sight of each other in the home stretch. For those on the Wager, the Gloucester now disappeared from view. Then the Trial and the Anna. The Wager was alone at sea. But despite the decimated crew and the ship being in the most crazy condition, Captain David Cheap was determined to continue the mission. And if you thought that what you heard so far was bad, it was about to get a whole lot worse. But that's for the next episode. See you there. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you don't want to miss any future episodes, subscribe.